bits and pieces of world history that have been floating around disconnected in your brain since high school. Things like the Silk Road, the spice trade, the Peloponnesian War. Well, this book, A Splendid Exchange, How Trade Shaped the World, neatly ties it all together, showing how we got where we are today. And like the Grateful Dead sang, what a long, strange trip it's been. So I was thrilled when the author William Bernstein agreed to address our humble organization. Mr. Bernstein holds a PhD in chemistry and he is an MD. He practiced neurology until retiring from that field. He is a believer in the value of the creative nonfiction process in helping to organize his leisure time reading. He wrote the bestsellers The Birth of Plenty in 2004 and A Splendid Exchange in 2006. He has also written numerous books on investing and is a co-founder of the investment management firm Efficient Frontier Advisors. Please help me welcome to the lectern William Bernstein.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. Well, I do want to clear up one bit of information here. I'm from Portland, and Portland is not the city that young people go to retire. They go there to get piercings and to work in Thai food carts. They're very, very industrious. I would like to tell you that this is a subject I've been interested in all of my life, and it was only a matter of time before I wrote a book about the history of world trade, but that's really not how these things occur. What actually happened was about 8 years ago, I got a phone call from a man with the unlikely name of Brando Skyhorse, who was an acquisitions editor at Grove Atlantic Press, and he said, we'd like you to write a book about the history of world trade. And I said, well, in the first place, it's not something I know an awful lot about. In the second place, it's not something I'm terribly interested in. And in the third place, you've got the wrong Bernstein. The Bernstein that you really wanted was Peter Bernstein, who's a famous financial and economic history author. And there followed this sort of awkward pause. And he said, well, we actually had lunch with Mr. Bernstein last week, and he's kind of tied up. I know he's writing a book about the history of the Erie Canal. He said, yeah, we found that out too. He said, but there was this other Bernstein out there who just might be interested in the process. So I went out from my den into the family room where my wife was finishing off her coffee, her morning coffee, and the New York Times crossword puzzle, and I told her the story. And she put them both down, and she looked at me and she said, do you know who Grove Atlantic Press is? And I said, well, not really. She said, well, do you know who Grove Press is? And I said, well, yeah, Doris Lessing, P.G. O'Rourke, Henry Miller. And she said, right, that one. And you have heard of the Atlantic Monthly? And I said, well, I've heard of those two, heard of that too. And she said, that's Grove Atlantic Press. If you value your career as a nonfiction writer, you will write whatever they want you to write, even if it's a cookbook. And suddenly, a history of world trade looked mighty good compared to a cookbook. So I got into the process, the nonfiction process. And what I discovered, the more I read, the more I delved into the subject, was that the cracks and the stresses and the strains and the discontents of globalization are a very old story. And you could pick almost any random century from about the dawn of the Common Era on, and you could find stories that resonate today. And I picked, when I started giving this talk several years ago, I picked one random century just to show you the density of these stories, and that's the 17th century. And I'm going to start with two vignettes from the 17th century. The first begins in the year 1635 in Mexico City, when the Chinese barbers of that city, the Spanish barbers of that city, that is the bloodletters, complained about the presence of Chinese barbers in Mexico City. And the viceroy who received the complaint referred the matter to the city council, and it's not immediately clear what he recommended back to the viceroy. That's been lost to history. So that's the first vignette. Now, the second vignette actually begins in the year 1931, when a small boy is walking on the beach in Australia, in Western Australia, north of Perth. And he comes across a handful of silver coins, and he takes them to his parents, who take them to the local museum. And it turns out that they are Spanish coins from the 17th century. And people very quickly realize there's a wreck offshore. And they start looking for it. They don't find anything until 30 years later, when some spearfishermen, quite by accident, come across the wreck of a Dutch East Indiaman called the Vergulde Drek, the Golden Dragon, that had actually left Amsterdam in the year 1655. And they'd recover tens of thousands, 40, 50,000 of these silver coins, some of which were looted and some of which found their way into museums. So you might ask two questions hearing these vignettes. First of all, what the heck were Chinese barbers doing in Mexico City in the year 1635? And the second question is, how did a Dutch East Indiaman find its way to the western coast of Australia a century before Captain Cook supposedly discovered Australia? Okay? And if we're going to understand these two stories, you have to understand, first of all, the three primary luxury trade commodities of that period. They all begin, it's easy, they all begin with S. Spices, silk, and silver. Now, let's talk about the first ones first, the first one first, which is spices. It is difficult to imagine the grasp that spices held on the imagination of the medieval Europeans. This was the Armani suit and the Gucci shoe and the BMW all rolled up into one. It was an unimaginable luxury. It was very expensive, so it was a valuable marketing commodity from that point of view. But even better from the marketing point of view, it was wrapped in mystery. Okay, they came from the Spice Islands. And all that told you, when something was called the Spice Islands or the Tin Islands, it meant that you knew nothing about them except the fact that spices or tin came from them. In fact, when we're talking about these spices, we're talking about some, what we today consider very ordinary items. Nutmeg and mace, which come from the same fruit. Cloves, and those three items come from a group of islands just off of the west coast of New Guinea, or Irian Jaya, in the Moluccas. And then the fourth one was cinnamon, which came from Sri Lanka. And these were fabulously expensive. An ounce of cinnamon oil cost as much as an ounce of gold. And so it was this combination of luxury and mystery that drove the Europeans wild. When you walked into somebody's house in the medieval period and you smelled one of these spices, it announced to you, here lived someone with wealth and power. And whoever could control this trade would become fabulously wealthy. Whatever nation controlled this trade would become powerful beyond imagination. And it was spices that drove Diaz and da Gama and Columbus and Magellan on their voyages of discovery. They weren't looking for new worlds to discover. In fact, da Gama knew exactly where he wanted to go. He wanted to go to Calicut. In Western India. And it certainly wasn't, souls that they were trying to save. They killed a lot more souls than they saved in the process. They were looking for spices. When you visit Venice today and you look at the grand palazzos and the great architecture, you are seeing the spices the wealth that spices created. And that was just the tail end of it. That was just a small piece of it, because spices, of course, came from all the way across the Indian Ocean and usually went through between a half dozen and a dozen traders. At each step along the way, the price rose. And the Europeans only got the very tail end of that trade, and yet that tail end of the trade was something that was the source of the wealth, much of the wealth of Western Europe in that period. So that's spices. Silk. Silk was invented by the Chinese about 5,000 years ago, and it stayed a Chinese monopoly until about the dawn of the Common Era, when its secret and the worms leaked out to Japan, and then they very rapidly made themselves to India and Persia, and finally, in the 6th century AD, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian sends up a couple of industrial spies who, at great risk to their life and on their second try, finally reach China and take the worms back home. Now, of course, the mulberry bushes that you also needed grew in Western Europe, so that wasn't the problem. What you have to understand about silk is the further away you got from Japan, the lower the quality of the silk. So, from China, the lower the quality of the silk. So if you were a Japanese aristocrat, you really didn't want the local silk. You wanted the real stuff, the Chinese silk. Indian silk, Persian silk was okay. European silk, not so good. Even the Brits tried to get into the act. They tried making silk. Of course, they didn't do very good. And the world's lowest quality silk came from Mexico, where the Spaniards had exported it. Now, that will come into the story just a little later. The next question you have to ask, sequentially, is what did the Europeans have to pay for these spices? Well, the answer was precious little. The primary trade commodity that the Europeans had was wool, okay, which doesn't go over terribly well in a tropical climate. And the Europeans, in fact, had only one thing that the Asians wanted, and that was silver. And the bad news for the Europeans was that they didn't have any of it. Okay, the Roman mines had all been played out. There wasn't any left in Western Europe. And the big break came in the middle of the 16th century when the Mexicans discovered vast quantities of silver at Potosi in Peru, the Silver Mountain, and also in the surface deposits in western Mexico near modern-day Guanajuato. And all of a sudden, you had this enormous quantity of silver, and this trade really gets going. The Spaniards minted probably between 1 billion and 2 billion of the famous 8 real pieces, the pieces of 8. And it was too big to use in everyday commerce, and so they would cut it up into 1-bit pieces, 8 1-bit pieces. That's where our $quarter, the 2 bits, comes in. And the thing you have to realize about the silver dollar, the trade dollar, the Mexican 8 real piece, the piece of 8, was that it was the global currency of its day. It was the $100 bill and the MasterCard and the American Express card all rolled up into one. And it was found around the world. It would pay for nutmeg in the Bandas and calicos in the Gujarat, silk in Manila, coffee in Yemen, cinnamon in Ceylon. It was legal tender around the globe, and it was legal tender, the Spanish 8 real piece, in the United States until the year 1857. Okay, so we've got these 3 things, and you can see now what the global trade commodities, the long-distance ones, looked like. Now, the next question you have to ask is, how did this stuff get around the world? Okay, yeah, it got around the world in sailing ships, but how did the sailing ships get where they were going? And that's a fascinating story, because there are 3 planetary wind systems that you have to know about. Now, the first thing you have to know about is that land transport is fabulously expensive and inefficient and dangerous. We think that silk got from east to west along the Silk Road, and that was a very active trade route. Wrong. Because it was a land route that was 5,000 miles, 6,000 miles long. It was dangerous, and there was not the political stability along its length to support the trade. You had to be out of your mind to try and do that. Only 2 times in remote history was the Silk Road really open. The first time was around the Common Era, when the Han Empire in the east and the Roman Empire in the west produced enough stability so that people could trade. And then the second episode occurred for about 100 years during the Mongol ascendancy in the 12th, the 13th really, and 14th century. And that was the period when Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo were able to, and the Polo brothers, his uncle and father, were able to do their journeys. But the rest of the time it wasn't open. The most efficient way to get things from west to east and from east to west was, of course, on the monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean. And what you have to know about that is that there were 2 blows every year. There was the southwest monsoon, which blew in the summer from southwest to northeast. So it's how you went east across the Indian Ocean and north to China during the summer. And then the northeast monsoon blew in the opposite direction, south from China and then west. And so typically a trader, say a Gujarati who dealt with cloth, would start out from Calicut or Goa or Surat in his dhow, and he would catch the trade wind in about a 6-week period, and he would take pilgrims and his cloth to Mecca, let's say, okay? And he would deposit the pilgrims, pick up pick up ivory, pick up horses, and he would come back on the southwest monsoon. So he would return, the trader typically returned to his home port every year for years on end if he lived that long, which usually they didn't. Very dangerous journey. And you had to know two things about this Indian Ocean trade emporium, which was open really for 1,500 years, almost 2,000 years after the Greeks discovered it around, again, the dawn of the Common Era. The first was that it was run exclusively by Muslims for Muslims, okay? The Westerners couldn't get into the system at all. And Islam served as sort of an early version of the GATT. Because if you were a Muslim, you understood the trade rules. Remember, Muhammad was a trader. The Prophet was a trader. And so a lot of the Quran and the Hadith, the sayings about Muhammad, actually pertain to trade. Some very sort of interesting, at some points, very salty stories. And if you understand those rules, you could do well. And it might have been black Muslims, it might have been Indian Muslims, it might have been Malay Muslims, Indonesian Muslims, Chinese Muslims. The system was predominantly a Muslim. The second was that the Muslims controlled the Indian Ocean. Okay, after the initial victories, the initial Arab victories in the 6th and 7th centuries, particularly the 7th centuries, the traditional Western routes into the Indian Ocean were completely closed off, the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. And for almost 1,000 years, a European could not so much as dip an oar in the Indian Ocean. If you were a European, you were out of luck, which was why the spice trade was such a mystery. And that stayed in force until Da Gama finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope in the year 1498. And it's a long, complicated story, but basically the Westerners had been trained in the hard school of the Western Straits, okay? The Dardanelles and Gibraltar and the Kattegat and the English Channel, and they knew the importance of maritime choke points, which the Asians didn't. And they were able to mop them up pretty quickly with relatively minor setbacks. The next question, the next system you have to understand is the trade winds. Now the trade winds blow around the world, all right? Equatorially from east to west, and then at 45 degrees north and south latitude from west to east. And they blow all year around, and they're fairly reliable. It's what Columbus took in 6 weeks to get to the Caribbean, and it's what Magellan took all the way around the world. So that's the first system. The high latitude system is what Columbus took home, but it really was the most important route across the Pacific Ocean. Okay, that's really where it became very important. And in the year 1565, a couple of Spaniards, Alonso de Arellano and Friar Andres de Urdaneta, set off from the Spanish base in Manila and arrived in Acapulco 4 months later. That's pretty good sailing even today, all right? So now let's put together the pieces. I've sort of told you what sounds like a lot of disjointed stories, but it's not, all right? Because what you can now see is that the Spaniards took their silver and they put them on their treasure ships, the treasure galleons, typically 3 galleons. 1 galleon that was loaded down with silver, 2 guard ships, armed galleons, and they would take the equatorial system to Manila. And at Manila, they would pick up silk, they would exchange their silk for silver and also for spices, and they would then take the northern route back to Mexico City and to Peru. And in this way, the luxuries of the East were exchanged for the wealth of Croesus in the West. And this was an amazingly profitable trade. An Irish friar it's just amazed contemporaries of that era, European contemporaries. An Irish friar wrote in the year 1677 that in Mexico City, both men and women are excessive in their apparel, using more silks than stuffs and cloths. He was amazed at the thousands of vehicles, coaches he saw cruising up and down the Alameda, the main drag in Mexico City. And again, this is a quote from him: "Full of gallants, ladies, and citizens to see and be seen, to court and be courted. In the jewelry district, where a man's eyes may behold in less than an hour many millions worth of gold, silver, and jewels." Who got rich on this? The group of people who got rich on this were people called Manileños, who were Spaniards who originally started out in Manila. They were the first movers, and they got unbelievably wealthy. They started out from Manila, and they set up their warehouses in Mexico City and made an enormous amount of money. Well, now we're start to be able to understand these two stories that I told you. Okay, how did Chinese people get to Mexico City in the year 1635? Well, what happened was the Manileños brought the servants along with them, who were Chinese, and they came in particular from a suburb of Manila called Parian, which is where the Chinese servants all lived, which is a Chinese city to this day and the source of some racial strife. If you've read Amy Chua's wonderful book called World on Fire, she describes, her family actually comes from that group of Chinese who lived in the Philippines. And now we can also begin to understand how the Australian coins, or how the Spanish coins got to Australia. Now, there's another system that I mentioned that blows at 45 degrees south latitude, and these are the Roaring Forties. And they're called the Roaring Forties because they really get moving, because there is no land down there at 45 degrees south latitude. There's the southern tip of New Zealand, there's the southern tip of South America. That's it, okay? And these winds blow around the year at 40, 50 knots all year long. And in the year 1611, a Dutch sea captain by the name of Heinrich Brouwer starts out from Amsterdam, and he heads south and he rounds the Cape of Good Hope, and instead of doing what most navigators did in that era, the Portuguese and the Dutch and the English navigators, which was to head back up as fast as they could northeast back into the known seas, he struck off to the southeast into the void, terra incognita, there be dragons. And he catches this wind system, and he goes like the wind for 5,000 miles, hangs a left, threads the Sunday Strait, and arrives in Batavia 6 months after leaving Amsterdam. Again, another amazing navigational feat. This becomes the standard way of getting to the east from that point forward. And the trick was, you had to know when to turn left, okay? Because if you didn't turn left, you wound up splat hitting Western Australia, and there's no friendly coastline there. It's all reefs. It's all dangerous. And there were some spectacular wrecks. There was a ship called the Batavia, which set out from Amsterdam in the year 1629, and the crew did 3 really stupid things. Some of the crew members did. The first thing they did was mutinied. Okay. The next stupid thing they did was to kill the captain, who I believe was Brouwer's son-in-law, if I can remember correctly. And the third thing, and the most stupid thing they did, was they killed the navigator. And so, they wind up on this reef in Western Australia, and amazingly, 200 of the 300 crew and passengers survive and make it onto this almost waterless reef. But there's not a lot of water on the reef, and worse yet, the innocent members of the crew and passengers were the witness to a capital crime. So the mutineers systematically begin to slaughter everybody, just about all of the 200 people there. And when a rescue crew, and I'll put the word rescue in quotes because I'll explain what they were really there for in a minute, they found this awful, ghastly scene of bodies and draggly, mutineers, and they kept the story quiet for about 30 years, and then it finally got out into the open. Survivors told the story. Well, the rescue crew, they weren't there to rescue the crew and passengers, they were there to rescue the chests of gold and silver. They were expert Gujarati and Dutch divers, and they eventually were able to recover 10 of the 12 silver chests. Okay, so the rescue mission was a success, a great success. Now, in the year 1655, this other ship, the ship I mentioned originally, the Vergoelde Drek, suffers the same fate. It wasn't a mutiny, it was just a simple navigational error. And another rescue crew gets sent out, but they come up empty-handed. They find nothing. 7 members of that crew did make it back to Batavia in an open boat. They were the only survivors of that particular boat. And the silver coins from that treasure, from that ship, remained a mystery until a small boy is walking on the beach in Western Australia in the year 1931. Now, I'm going to fast forward to the 19th century and tell a story which is a little bit more relevant to you guys, all right, which is the roots of global trade politics. What we're talking about, for the most part, is a trade in luxury goods, because bulk goods were just too expensive to transport in that era. And the main problem wasn't that sea transport was expensive. Actually, you could do a reasonable transport in grain, particularly in rice, which tended to float downriver and was used as ballast. And so the Europeans got introduced to Asian rice fairly early. The problem was land transport, okay? If you were a farmer, let's say in the year 1840 or 1850, in North Dakota or Kansas, you might as well have been on the far side of the moon. In fact, if you were more than 30 miles from a port, you were out of luck. You're basically feeding yourself and your neighbors. You couldn't ship that abroad. And you would have thought that the invention of the railroad would have helped, but it didn't. The reason why was because the early railroads ran on iron. The boilers were made of iron, the rails were made of iron, and they wore out very quickly. Once a year, the boilers couldn't produce any power, they couldn't carry the load. It was a mess. What was needed was steel, okay? And the person who exploded global trade was Henry Bessemer, okay? Because Bessemer discovers a process for mass producing steel, and 95% of his first steel products went into rails. Okay, and all of a sudden, the agricultural bounty of North America, inland North America, and South America, and other places like the Ukraine and Australia and New Zealand, is able to reach Europe cheaply and easily. And the European farmers never knew what hit them. They were out of business. They were all out of business. The British farmers at least were able to find work in industry. The French and the German farmers remained protectionists to this day and started a series of trade wars, which of course culminated in the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Now, Jim wanted me to bring up the Pacific Northwest, and here's the Pacific Northwest connection, which is that Willis Hawley, the representative who was on that, was an Oregon representative. So that's Oregon's role in world trade. And the hero of the story is Cordell Hull. Cordell Hull realizes that the world's a mess. And in the detritus of World War II, the aftermath, he realizes that the imbalances of global trade and protectionism was in fact one of the big factors that was at the root of World War II. And he swears that it will never happen again. And his successors in the State Department in 1946 produced a document. It's the most important document I suspect no one in this audience has ever heard of. If you've heard of it, raise your hand. It's Proposals for the Expansion of Trade and Employment. Aha, thought so. Okay, that was the State Department document that gave rise to the GATT, which produced this dramatic fall in tariffs, which is the reason why all you people are in business. And the one hang-up with the GATT has always been agricultural goods for the reason that I just explained. It just goes too deep. It goes too deep not only in Europe, but in Asia as well. So clearly, by the end of the 17th century, and certainly by the end of the 19th century, all of the elements of globalization were really in place. Okay, we've got a global market in the most strategic commodities, and then in bulk commodities. We have a highly mobile international workforce. We have cheap Asian goods that are really upsetting people, and we have an international monetary system. And there are discontents aplenty, okay? There are winners and there are losers, and the losers are always very unhappy. The Spanish barbers of Mexico City, the Spanish silk producers of Mexico were apoplectic. There was also a trade in sugar in the 17th and 18th century. And sugar had been traditionally grown by Europeans in the Atlantic islands, like Madeira. And the Madeirans were apoplectic when all this cheap sugar suddenly starts coming by way of Brazil and undercutting the local market. The Madeirans couldn't even sell their silver sugar locally because the Brazilian sugar was so cheap. And in fact, they got and sought trade protection. In the year 1699, weavers who were upset at cheap Indian calicos rioted. They attacked the Parliament, rioted in the streets of London, attacked the head of the headquarters of the East India Company, as well as the house of Sir Josiah Child, who was the governor of the company. Does this sound familiar to anyone here in Seattle? This was the World Trade Riots of 1699, not 1999. And then finally, my favorite story is this story of the Boston Tea Party. We all have this, we were all taught in 7th grade the Boston Tea Party was because people were, the patriots were upset at taxation. No. The Tea Act of 1773 had absolutely nothing to do with taxes. It was a free trade act. All right? It was an act that allowed the East India Company to directly sell tea, which the colonials were addicted to, in Boston and in New York. It would have halved the price of tea to the consumers, okay? Who didn't like this? Tea merchants and smugglers. And they dressed up in blankets and painted their faces and dumped the tea into the harbor. Now, so obviously, people are a little confused about the Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party, and I could tell you that this has some modern residents, but it would be too cheap, an easy and cheap a shot. So I won't do that. And in the course of writing this book, I came across many more of these stories. And all you have to do is just modernize the grammar a little bit, change the proper nouns, and you might as well be reading, the transcript from a Senate hearing on the latest Trade Act. It's not a new story at all. Now, again, Jim wanted me to tell the story that had to do with Seattle. And I'll try and make this somewhat relevant. I actually wanted to entitle the book From Sumer to Seattle. All right? And my publisher didn't go for it. I have this horrible problem with my publisher, Grove Atlantic, and titles. I mean, when it comes to titles of The Princess and the Pea, nothing ever makes them happy. And it took me 6 months. It took me longer to get the title, the 3 words, the title, including the article A, than any of the other 120,000 words in the book. And I'm having that problem with my most recent effort as well with them. But obviously, there were some events here in 1999. People were unhappy. Now, Seattle, if you got to find a pro-free trade city in this country, Seattle's got to be it. And yet you had some local people, as well as obviously some outside people, who were unhappy. If you're a steel worker in Pittsburgh, if you're an auto worker in Detroit, you're even less happy with the state of free trade and with free trade agreements, because there are always winners and there are always losers. The people in this room are all winners, okay? And I happen to believe, in a strictly economic sense, that free trade is a good thing. It makes the whole pie bigger. But it also does produce losers. And this is a reality that you have to deal with, and you certainly dealt with on the streets in 1999. People are going to get hurt, and they have to be compensated, okay? At a bare minimum, you can't throw them out of their jobs, outsource them out of their jobs, and not provide them with health care and unemployment insurance. Free trade doesn't work without a decent social safety net. If you want to have anarchy, you try and do things the libertarian way, which is to have free trade and then let people fend for themselves when they get hurt. And it's a political necessity. If you want to have free trade, if you want to get it through the appropriate political channels, you're going to have to get some buy-in from people. And by providing that safety network, you will get that buy-in. It is no accident that if you draw a graph of the richness of the social safety net on one axis and the percent of a nation's economy that is due to trade on the other axis, it's almost a straight line. The regression slope is very, very tight. You really can't have one without the other. So with that little bit of blue state politics behind us, I will close with my favorite quote from Harry Truman, which is, "The only thing that's new in the world is the history you haven't read." And I think this is a history that we ignore at our peril. I thank you and open it for questions.
answer, but you didn't. And that is how the Persian stranglehold on the spice trade resulted in us speaking Portuguese in Sao Paulo.
Oh, well. All right. The first people to deal in the spice trade were the Portuguese. Okay, I'm sorry. I should do that automatically. The question is how did we wind up speaking Portuguese in Sao Paulo? And that's an amazing story. First of all, the Portuguese, through da Gama and Bru and so forth, were the first people to break into the Indian Ocean. They were able to. They were the first Europeans to do the direct spice trade, but the Portuguese were sort of the dog that caught the car. They were a nation of 1 million people, and they just could not project the kind of power to do what they had to do, which was to collect silver. They had no silver, so they had to steal it. And they simply could not project the amount of money that they needed, the amount of money to project the amount of power they needed to steal spices from the Spice Islanders. And so they very quickly lost out. But in the process, of losing that spice trade to the Dutch and to the English, who were much better, situated to take it, they also got much more heavily involved in the sugar trade. And the first the first Portuguese people to wind up in Sao Paulo were there when the first Portuguese explorers hit the continent of South America quite by mistake, because the way you rounded the Cape of Good Hope was first to head southwest in the direction of Brazil, and then you would make a sharp left and go around the Cape Horn. And so I forget who it was. I think it was Almeida, who was the first the first Portuguese to hit Brazil accidentally, and it was a great place to grow sugar, which was the primary luxury trade item of the 18th century. So that's how we wound up speaking Portuguese in Sao Paulo. And also, well, there's another reason why, which was that, of course, Portugal lay on the east side of the Tordesillas line. It was sort of funny. The Portuguese and the Spanish were fighting over the globe the way two kids would fight over a marble. And one day they get together at this sleepy Spanish town called Tordesillas, and they divide the world in half along a line which is roughly the 35th meridian or something like that. Which basically hides off Brazil from the rest of South America. So that's how the west part of South America is Spanish, the right half is the eastern half is Portuguese. But what was really interesting is they didn't realize it went all the way around the world. And the dividing line in the eastern hemisphere, no one was really clear which side of these Spice Islands, which side of that line the Spice Islands lay on. And Magellan, who was a Portuguese sailor who had fallen out with the Portuguese king, then went to the Spanish king and said, "I know where the Spice Islands are. They're actually on the Spanish side. Let me sail for you." And of course he was wrong, but that's besides the point. Which is another interesting story. The first person who sailed around the world wasn't Magellan. In fact, Magellan was killed in the Philippines, as we all know. The first person to sail around the world was a man by the name of Enrique of Malacca. And Enrique was a slave, a Malay slave from somewhere around Singapore or Malacca, who winds up getting to Europe with Magalhaes or Magellan as his slave, and then goes around the world, with him back to the Philippines. And when Magellan is killed in the Philippines, he says, "I'm released. The boss told me that if he ever died, I became a free man." And the second in command who took over the voyage said, "Oh, no, you're not." And Enrique said, "To heck with you," and he goes off scot-free and probably returns home. So Enrique of Malacca was the first person to circle the globe. Interesting story.
I'd be interested in any thoughts you have on the use of the creation of heroin as a currency for British and the Americans.
Yeah, it was opium. All right, here's the
Thank you.
here's the deal. Heroin was an invention of the late 19th century, a wonderful medical invention of the late 19th and 20th century that was promoted by Freud as a treatment for opium addiction. One of the many great things that Freud did for Western society. Yeah, exactly. I'm a neurologist, so don't get me started on Freud. So okay, the question is opium. One of the other luxury trades of a later period of the 18th and 19th century was tea. Okay, the English were just absolutely nuts about tea, and the British didn't have enough silver to pay for all the tea they wanted, so they tried to find something that the Chinese wanted. And that something was opium. Okay. In fact, the Brits were just absolutely hemorrhaging silver to the Chinese to pay for all the tea. And it was a national emergency. And opium was the cure for that fiscal imbalance. And I have to admit that when you read the history of opium addiction in China, yes, it's a shameful episode in English history. And there are a lot of fascinating domestic English political things that had to do with, and stories you could tell about that. But at the end of the day, it was primarily a social drug, and it was used responsibly by 95% of the Chinese who used it. There's a wonderful passage from Somerset Maugham, who visited China and wanted to see an opium den. And it was kind of like going to a sewing party. There was an old grandfather bouncing his grandchild on his knee. There were little old ladies talking and playing mahjong. You might as well have been at the American Legion. It was not a den of iniquity, and that was it wasn't that terrible of a thing. It was really more a source of I think, political embarrassment to the emperor than anything else.
Sir?
Yeah.
You mentioned about Moluccas. We are from Indonesia, and one of the island, Moluccas, my friend is from the spicy island. So what about the role of the Dutch here? After the Portuguese, the Dutch colonized us, and many spices of our spices go to the Netherlands.
Yeah, okay, well, first of all, there's some background here, which is that the First World War was actually fought in the 17th century around the world, where the Dutch slowly rolled up the original Portuguese colonizers. They rolled up almost the entirety of the Portuguese Empire in the East, except for Goa and Macau. That was it. That was all they were left with. They had Formosa, they had, a lot of the Indonesian islands. And it was fought in, the Dutch almost threw the Portuguese out of Brazil as well. So it was this global conflict that lasted decades. It was fought around the world between the Dutch and the Portuguese. The Dutch largely won. The Dutch role in Indonesia, as I don't have to tell you, is nothing short of horrific. I don't have to tell you what they did in the Spice Islands, and you could probably tell the story better than I can, which is they basically either slaughtered or exported the entire population, and then when their own slaves that they brought in couldn't raise the spices properly, they started collecting the people they had expelled and brought them back as slaves again to the Spice Islands. And that's just for starters. And then what follows is another 300 years of iniquitous Dutch rule in Indonesia. Do you want to say anything nice about the Dutch?
Yeah, nice thing we have Christianity there.
Thank you. Absolutely.